Today's conveyancing clients expect speed, clarity, and frequent updates. But tight margins and rising client expectations put pressure on conveyancing practices. With smart automation and clear workflows, Leap helps conveyancing teams spend less time on admin and more time supporting their clients. Learn more at leap.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today, we welcome back Rob Gurney and Ben Robinson from Landmark, and we are doing our slightly shorter version of the podcast looking at the latest quarterly trends report, which covers the first quarter of 2026. Crikey, the year is moving at quite a pace, isn't it? We're chatting at a point in time in April when the world has entered a huge amount of uncertainty with some of the conflict that's happening in the Middle East, and of course that's having a knock-on impact here with inflation and oil prices, that kind of thing. So I don't know, and perhaps you guys can provide some insight into how much that we can tell from this report, whether we can forward look at what that is going to tell us about the course of the next few months. But let's take it for what it is in the first instance. And Ben, if you wouldn't mind starting with a bit of insight into what's happening on the supply side of the market, please.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, from the report you can see it was, just to state the numbers, it was 3% up year on year in the quarter in terms of properties coming to market, and actually that started with a big jump. So the heavy lifting of that was done in Jan, which was 6% up. Not that we often get anything right, especially in this uncertain world, but if you remember the last podcast, we were talking about the impact of the late budget last year putting people off listing their property, and that perhaps there was some pent up supply ready to come through in Q1, and Jan being the heaviest lifter of those months suggested that's exactly what happened. There were some people who would normally have come on towards the end of last year who put it off and wait to come in, and that suggests, you know, we've got intention to move, which of course is the start of demand, and I'll leave that more to Rob and to talk about the picture there. But it's not the whole insight it gives us, because actually there is currently due to come through the renters reform. So in reforming the rental space, it's making it harder for landlords, to be frank, to make money. What we're seeing then is landlords look to exit. Certainly when we talk to agents at the coalface, that's what they're seeing, especially the accidental landlords, of which there are many. Those people who have the luxury of having a second property by accident due to life circumstances, they kept it as an investment. Now longer can make it work, especially with interest rates in a decent place, look to exit and take away the stress. What that is of course supply without the intent to move, so it doesn't create purchases, onward purchases. So we have a dearth of purchases, which is, you know, creating its own problems further downstream.
And I mean, ultimately what the impact of that is that we've got more choice. We probably are going to have slower transactions, and in fact we were just chatting before we started recording, we're likely to see an uplift in fall throughs as a result of that, Ben, because you don't have to choose that house, and that quirk that you didn't particularly like, you know, you don't have to live with, because there are alternatives on the market.
Exactly that. You know, we've seen a huge shift from post-COVID, where it was very much a seller's market. Everything was selling as soon as it was on. In fact, most or a lot was selling off market, 10 buyers to every one, to a world where we've got lots of choice, and choice creates uncertainty, just like any even restaurant menu. If there's too much choice, it's sometimes hard to pick. And actually then when you look at the complexity of the process, the longer it takes, the more likely you're hard to think about what else is out there. When there's a lot, you probably quite quickly will move on. And I think we're seeing obviously lots of news corroborate that exchanges are taking longer, completions are taking longer, commitment is harder to get because of the lack of buyers for property to sell. I mean, of course, slightly looking forward, the world's uncertain again, so that doesn't help either. That creates the same thing as the budget created last time, which is buyers saying loads of choice. I'm not going to need to rush, I might as well wait until things stabilise, which is never good news in terms of commitment. And let's be fair, the majority of the industry is paid when people commit, not when people decide to sell.
So, Rob, you can give us some insight into the knock-on impact of that.
Sure. Yes. So I'll sort of split my update into three parts: SSTCs, completions, and then I'll give a bit of an insight in terms of the completion to instruction ratio, which is always quite an interesting thing to end with. So in terms of sold subject to contracts, we have seen a relatively stable quarter, January to March. But it obviously does appear that the market is down on last year. Just to give you the numbers, January we were about 90%, Feb 92, and March 93. So an upwards trend, but a small but positive one. And the problem here is that it's really hard to tell how much impact the build up to last year's SDLT deadline had on properties sold in this quarter and lawyer case instructions, because there almost certainly in that number will be a percentage, certainly of January and possibly even February's numbers, where there was over optimistic buyers kind of still hoping to avoid, the extra stamp duty payments by getting something through really quickly, which, we know in today's conveyancing process is a big ask if we're averaging, 4 to 5 months. But anyway, so it's hard to know how much of that was like transactions that would have happened later on in the year but brought forward because of the possibility of saving a bit of cash. But nevertheless, the month-on-month upward trend is definitely a positive one. March only being 7% deficit to the previous year. And just for a bit of context, November 25 versus November 24 was 25% down. But obviously, November was presumably when the bulk of the stampede to get, properties, property sales agreed and lawyers instructed were probably at its peak, sort of 4 to 5 months before the stamp duty change. So yeah, a recovering position, but a gradual one, and still under last year's numbers month on month. In terms of completions, completely different set of figures really, and some of them quite shocking until you realise why this has happened. But we'll look at January completions. We were actually 101%, so slightly above the January 25 number. February was 91%, and March 55%. Wow. So basically, this March, the number of completions was just over half of all of those completions that happened in March last year, for obvious reasons, as we've already talked about in terms of that mad dash that happened up to the end of quarter 125. But I think it's a bit misleading to sort of say we're 55%. Does that mean we're 45% down? Compared month to month, and yes, we are. But actually, in reality, we've seen an increase in completion numbers from January to February to March 2026. So March has been the biggest completion month to date, even though it completely paled into insignificance versus last March. Because last year's numbers were so heavily influenced by SDLT, it makes where we currently ended March 26 look bad when actually it's not, because we're not comparing apples with apples. What I think will be quite cool for law firms, and especially those that are targeted against last year's performance, April's going to be quite good fun, isn't it? Because as we know, April 25 completions just completely fell off a cliff. I checked today, and as we speak, we're currently seeing 38% positive variance to last April. So yeah, happy days. Even though in real terms the April completion numbers aren't great, but they're much better than last April's. So that's where we are completion wise. And then just very quickly on the ratio between lawyer instructions and completions. Almost flat quarter, 62% Jan, 61% Feb, 61% March. So we've experienced 3 months where the ratio between new cases instructed and existing cases completed fluctuate by only 1%, which is quite rare. And what that does suggest is a very welcome period of stability for conveyancing firms, because you're not having to deal with any unexpected dips or spikes, because they're the nightmare ones that that are really tough to resource for. So being able to sort of have a steady balance between new incoming work and old work out the door is obviously a good thing. But what I would say is that ratio being consistently in the low 60s is a bit low, and it does suggest that pipelines are increasing, which obviously is a good thing as long as we start seeing completions coming out the other end, in the next 3 months. If they don't, then obviously, we have to start looking at other negative factors that Ben's already mentioned, such as higher levels of fall throughs and obviously, consumer hesitation based on the current state of the world. Hopefully 60% isn't the new norm.
It's going to be really interesting, isn't it? Because as I said at the start of the discussion, how much of the information that we've just kind of talked about and presented is relevant to the next couple of months? I mean, we've always historically looked back and thought, actually we can forward project here because of the information that we have here. But we're at a point in time where, as we've discussed, there's so much uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds uncertainty, and we know what the impact of that is on the market, that actually the last 3 months were almost irrelevant.
Yeah, and to add to your sort of uncertainty dilemma, it's kind of, it would be easier if the previous year had been a normal one.
Yeah.
But because of what happened with SDLT, it's just completely messed up that ramp up to the end of March, but then of course the drop off afterwards. So we're not looking back to a normal year anyway. So I would argue that April and May's completion numbers will be favourable to the previous year, but that doesn't mean it's in a good state.
Happy days for year-on-year targets.
I think to try and add positivity moving forwards as well. Mortgage rates coming down again after peaking recently and removing in reaction. Perhaps the world is getting less sensitive to lots of huge news, because ultimately it's happening so often, and people need to get moving. So as those mortgage rates come down, they meet an affordability point that will get people to commit again. If we can just get the stability in the background, there's clearly people wanting to move. And as a buyer, yes, you've got choice, but also you've got perhaps as good a time price-wise in the next year to buy as you're going to find for a long time. If you look at real house prices, factor for inflation, they're pretty similar to many years ago now, certainly way lower than the post-COVID sort of spike. So the affordability should be better. Interest rates coming down help that. And of course, lots and lots of properties, there is pressure on price, even further pressure on price if they're not selling and people do want to move. So, for buyers, that's a time to perhaps just commit and move forward. So, fingers crossed that we do get stability soon. And, with those mortgage rates coming down, we do start to see people get moving again.
We don't really discuss remortgage on this podcast a huge amount, but there's a really interesting statistic that I wanted to share with you guys that I lends itself to this conversation, which is there are a huge number of 5-year fixed mortgage deals secured during that period where we saw that massive property boom during COVID, late 2020, early 2021. Secured at very low rates, which are coming to a conclusion. Yeah. And Bank of England, UK Finance have both said they foresee a very strong remortgage year this year. It will be interesting to see what impact that has on the market, as well as people come off what were averages of, from memory, 1.8, 1.9% to 4.5, 4.6%.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, you would have thought it would encourage some downsizing if people have got in bigger properties have obviously higher leverage, because that's where the bigger impact comes in. And certainly I'm can't speak for Mike, but knowing what he tells us every week, if you look at the last month or so, or 2 months as the conflict started, we saw a real spike in remortgage valuations go through our pipe, and some purchase requests as well, because people are obviously trying to lock in deals on their purchase before they moved ahead. But certainly remortgages, and where we see remortgage in the business, because we do in multiple places, we saw a huge spike then as well of people saying, okay, let's just get ahead of this, because if uncertainty's for longer, interest rates going up, I don't want to even, I want to reduce the pain as much as possible by committing now. Obviously, with things flattening out a little bit, it'll go back, but I think we will see that shift the market, but that will drive more supply, which we're not really short of at the moment.
As ever, it's a reasonably short kind of synopsis of what's happening in the market. It will be fascinating to reconvene in 3 months' time and see what the second quarter of 2026 brings us. But for what it's worth, given the context of the conversation today, on context of what's happening in the world, it's been great to have you on to discuss the first quarter of 2025, and I guess probably fingers crossed for conveyancers over the course of the next few months. Thank you to Rob and to Ben for joining.
Cheers, David.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Ben and to Rob. Thank you as ever for listening. We'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.